They told me I didn't belong at their Christmas table. So I filled mine with complete strangers. My daughter-in-law looked me dead in the eye, set down her wine glass, and told me there simply wasn't room for me at the Christmas table this year. 71 years old, and I got demoted to a folding chair in the laundry room. But nobody, and I mean nobody, humiliates Tiffany and gets to keep sitting comfortably. What I did next didn't just ruin their perfect holiday, it changed the way that whole family looked at each other forever. Before I tell you exactly how sweet my revenge turned out to be, hit that like button, subscribe if you're new here, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from tonight. I read every single one, and honestly hearing from all of you is what gets me through these long winter evenings now. Alright, let's get into it. My name is Tiffany. I'm 71 years old and for 43 years I hosted Christmas. Not just any Christmas, the one everybody planned their December around. I made the turkey with the cornbread stuffing my own mother taught me. I handwrote place cards for every single person, even the ones who only showed up to eat and leave. I strung lights on a 14-foot tree by myself for 2 decades after my husband passed, standing on a wobbly step ladder at 70 years old because nobody else in that family bothered to offer. I raised one son. His name doesn't matter anymore, not the way it used to. He married a woman I'll just call the daughter-in-law, because after what happened, I don't feel like giving her the dignity of being remembered fondly in my own story. She was polished, beautiful in that magazine cover way. Perfect Instagram captions, perfect candle scents, perfect little charcuterie boards. And from the very first Thanksgiving I met her, I felt something cold behind her smile. The kind of cold you can't quite name but your gut absolutely knows. For years I told myself I was imagining it. She was polite to my face. She said thank you so much every time I babysat my grandchildren for free, every time I drove 90 minutes each way to help after her second baby was born, every time I quietly slipped money into birthday cards because I knew things were tight before my son got that promotion. I told myself that's what family does. You show up. You give. You don't keep score. But she was keeping score the whole time. I just didn't know what side of the ledger I was on. Last November my son called me, and I could hear that particular tightness in his voice, the one he's had since he was 7 years old and about to admit he broke something. He said, "Mom, we need to talk about Christmas this year." My heart actually skipped because I thought maybe finally they were asking me to come earlier to help decorate, to spend more time, not less. Instead, he told me that her parents were flying in from out of state, that her sister and brother-in-law and their 4 kids were coming too, that the dining room table, my dining room table, the one I'd given them as a wedding gift, only sat 12 comfortably, and that they had already worked out the seating. I asked quite reasonably, I thought, where exactly I'd be sitting. There was a pause. A long one. And then he said so quietly I almost didn't catch it, "There's a spot set up in the laundry room, Mom. Just for the meal. You'd still be there for presents and everything after." The laundry room. Not the kitchen. Not a card table wedged into the corner of the dining room like an afterthought. The laundry room next to the detergent and the drying rack, while her parents, people who had known my son for exactly 6 years, sat at the table I paid for, eating food I probably would have ended up cooking anyway. Because let's be honest, nobody in that house can make a decent gravy without me on speakerphone talking them through it. I didn't yell. I didn't cry, not on the phone anyway. I just said I understand and hung up. Now here's where I need you to understand something about me. I have spent my entire adult life being the person who understands. The one who doesn't make waves. The one who swallows the hurt because keeping the peace always felt more important than being right. My mother raised me that way and I raised my son that way. And somewhere along the line being agreeable turned into being erasable. But 71 years old is a strange and wonderful age, because you start running out of patience for being erased. I sat in my kitchen that night with a cup of tea going cold in front of me, and I made a decision. If there wasn't room for me at their table, I would simply build my own. And I decided, right then, staring at my own reflection in that dark window, that my table would be fuller, warmer, and louder than theirs would ever be again. The first thing I did was call my neighbor, a widower named Frank who I knew spent every holiday alone since his wife passed 3 years back. I'd seen him shoveling his driveway on Thanksgiving morning last year, all by himself, and it broke my heart even then. I asked him if he had plans for Christmas dinner. He laughed, a little sad sound, and said, "Plans to eat a frozen dinner and watch whatever's on television probably." I told him he had plans now. Then I thought about the young woman who works the early shift at my pharmacy, the one who mentioned once while ringing up my blood pressure medication that she'd moved here from 3 states away for a nursing program and couldn't afford the flight home for the holidays. I didn't even know her last name. I just knew her face lit up a little every time I asked about her classes. I went back to that pharmacy 2 days later and asked her point blank if she had anywhere to be on Christmas Day. She looked so surprised that a customer even remembered that conversation, let alone cared enough to follow up. She said no, she'd probably just work an extra shift since holiday pay was good. And there was nothing else pulling her home. There was something pulling her now. My address. I put a notice up at the community center where I do water aerobics twice a week. A simple little flyer that just said, "Alone this Christmas? So am I, apparently. Home-cooked dinner. All are welcome. No charge, just bring your appetite and your best stories." I left my number. My phone rang 11 times that week. 11. A retired veteran who hadn't had a real Christmas dinner in 6 years because his kids lived overseas. A young couple who just moved to town for work and didn't know a single soul yet. An elderly woman even older than me, 92 years old, sharp as a tack, who told me her own family had gotten too busy for her the last 3 Decembers running. By the time I finished making calls, I had 13 people committed to Christmas dinner at my house. 13 strangers who, within a few conversations, stopped feeling like strangers at all. I want to pause here and tell you something because I think it matters more than the revenge part of this story, even though I know that's what you're here for. Every single person I called said some version of the same thing. "Are you sure? Really sure? You don't even know me." And every single time I told them the truth. I said, "I know what it feels like to not be wanted somewhere, and I decided nobody who calls me should have to feel that on Christmas." I spent the 2 weeks leading up to the holiday the happiest I'd been in years. I planned a menu big enough to feed 20, just in case anyone brought someone along. I dug my grandmother's china out of storage, the good stuff I hadn't used since my husband was alive, because I always felt silly setting a fancy table just for myself. I handwrote place cards again, 13 of them, plus a few extra blanks in case somebody's cousin or coworker needed somewhere to land too. My son called twice during those weeks. Both times I kept the conversation short and pleasant. He mentioned, almost casually, that his mother-in-law was bringing her famous ham, and that everyone was excited. I said that sounded lovely. I did not mention what I was building, 13 place settings at a time, 3 miles across town. Christmas Eve my son called again, and this time there was a little hesitation in his voice that told me something had shifted. He said his wife's sister had to cancel last minute, some kind of family emergency on her husband's side, which meant there was, quote, actually room now if you wanted to come for the meal after all. If you wanted to come after all. As if I'd been sitting around waiting for a spot to open up. As if the laundry room offer 3 weeks earlier hadn't already told me exactly where I stood. I thanked him for letting me know, and I told him as gently and honestly as I could that I already had plans. He asked what plans. I said I was hosting Christmas dinner myself this year for some friends. He got quiet and then he asked who. I told him the truth. A neighbor, a young nursing student, some folks from the community center, people who needed somewhere warm to be. He didn't say much after that. I think he was trying to figure out how to feel about his mother building an entire holiday out of people he'd never met, in the time it took his wife to decide I wasn't worth a real seat at her table. Christmas Day, my house filled up in a way it hadn't in years. Frank showed up first, holding a bottle of wine and looking almost nervous, like he wasn't sure he was allowed to enjoy himself yet. The nursing student came next, and she brought a pie homemade because she said her grandmother taught her and she wanted to contribute something. The veteran arrived in a pressed shirt, said it was the first time he'd worn something other than a t-shirt on Christmas in years. The 92-year-old woman arrived on her granddaughter's arm, and even the granddaughter stayed because, as she put it, Grandma talks about coming here more than she's talked about anything in months. By early afternoon, my dining room was loud in the best possible way. Strangers were trading stories like old friends. Frank and the veteran discovered they'd both grown up 2 towns over from each other, and spent 20 minutes arguing good-naturedly about a diner that had closed decades ago. The young couple who just moved to town got so many phone numbers by the end of the meal that I think they left with more friends than they'd made in their entire 6 months here combined. I sat at the head of my own table in my own home surrounded by 13 people who wanted to be there, who were grateful to be there, who looked at me like I mattered. And I felt something I hadn't felt in longer than I want to admit. I felt like I belonged somewhere because I'd built the somewhere myself. Somewhere around dessert, my phone buzzed. A photo from my son. His table, the one I paid for, looked lovely, I'll give them that. 12 places, all filled. Everyone smiling for the camera. But I noticed something in that photo I don't think he meant for me to notice. There was an empty chair pushed slightly away from the table's edge, angled oddly, like it had been there and then wasn't needed and nobody bothered to remove it. My old chair. The one I'd sat in for over a decade before this year. I didn't respond to the photo right away. I finished my dinner first, surrounded by people who'd never once made me feel like an inconvenience. The days after Christmas, word got around the way it does in families. My son's mother-in-law, apparently, made a comment at their own dinner table about how some people make such a show out of everything, hosting strangers instead of accepting a gracious invitation. I heard this secondhand from my son, who I think was fishing to see if it would upset me. It didn't upset me at all. I told him the truth. I said I wasn't making a show. I was making a table where everybody who sat down knew without question that they were wanted there. I asked him plainly if he could say the same thing about the laundry room. He didn't have an answer for that, which was honestly answer enough. Here's the part that really got everyone talking though. That flyer I put up at the community center? A few people took pictures of my table that day and shared them in a local community group online, just talking about how nice it was that a stranger opened her home to people who had nowhere else to go. It got passed around more than I expected. My daughter-in-law's own cousin, who I'd never even met, apparently saw the post and commented something about how she wished she'd known about it, because her own grandmother had spent Christmas alone that year too. That comment made its way back to my daughter-in-law directly. And from what I understand, it did not go over well at her own family gathering. Because suddenly, the story wasn't just about the daughter-in-law inviting her own parents and turning her husband's own mother into an afterthought in a laundry room. The story became about a woman who was pushed out of her own family's table and, instead of shrinking, expanded. The contrast between the two Christmases, hers exclusive and mine wide open, wasn't subtle to anyone who saw both. Since then, things have shifted in ways I didn't fully expect. My son has called more in the past month than he did in the 6 before it. He's asked more than once if he and the grandkids can come by on a random Saturday, no occasion needed, just to visit. I think something cracked open in him when he saw that photo I finally sent back. The one of my table full of laughing strangers who'd become, by the end of the night, something closer to friends. I think he realized his mother wasn't someone who needed a favor of space at somebody else's table. I was someone capable of building an entire world of her own, warm enough that people wanted to stay in it. As for my daughter-in-law, I haven't heard directly from her. Not really, beyond a stiff holiday card that arrived a full 2 weeks late this year. I don't need an apology from her, honestly. I don't need her to understand what she did. I only needed to prove to myself more than anyone that being pushed aside by people who are supposed to love you doesn't mean you stop deserving a full table. Frank and I have had dinner together 3 more times since Christmas, just the two of us now, comparing notes on our grief and our grandkids in our gardens. The nursing student stops by on Sundays sometimes with coffee, says my house is the only place in this town that's ever felt like home to her. The veteran brought his fishing buddy to meet me last month, said he wanted him to meet the woman who saved his Christmas. I've started calling this little group of ours a family because honestly that's exactly what it became. I'm planning next Christmas already. Bigger table this time. I bought a longer one secondhand. Refinished it myself with sandpaper and stubborn hands that ache a little more every winter. But it was worth every splinter. I've already got calls coming in from people who heard what happened last year and want to know if there's room. There's always room. That's the whole point. When you build your own table, you get to decide who sits at it, and you get to decide that nobody who wants to be there ever has to wonder if they belong. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever been the person nobody made room for, I want you to know something. You don't need permission to build your own table. You don't need an invitation to be surrounded by people who choose you. Sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't anger at all. It's simply thriving loudly, warmly, in a life you built for yourself after someone tried to shrink you down to a folding chair in the laundry room. Thank you for sitting with me through this one tonight. If you're new here, welcome to the table. Subscribe, hit that like button, and tell me in the comments, has your family ever made you feel like there wasn't room for you? I read every single story, and I promise you, whatever you've been through, there's a seat for you here too. I'll see you at the next one.